Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War Warhammer 2 Quick Match gameplay. This time around we are playing a little bit of Wood Elf on Dwarf action, so of course this promises to be an interesting game. The Wood Elves do have a bit of a rough matchup here, so for my composition I did decide to go very heavily into armor piercing, which is basically mandatory. I did not bother with the branch wraith, so definitely a slight divergence from my usual strategy of running a branch wraith, but in place of it, I do still have a hero. I did still bring a Spellslinger of Life. Unfortunately, I forgot to put on a Power Stone, and that was definitely a major mistake this game. Though perhaps not that impactful. My front line here is composed entirely of Eternal Guard with shields. These guys are not veteraned up. Their melee attack is somewhat pitiful at only 26, though still a lot better than most other spear infantry. But they do have 44 melee defense as well as armor-piercing damage, as well as silver shields, of course. So they can tank through enemy shooting pretty effectively. They should be pretty good at least tying down and hopefully eventually overwhelming the dwarven front line. They are backed by 3 units of Wildwood Rangers, which are really rather monstrous and can do a lot. Definitely lay the smackdown on a lot of dwarven infantry. They can definitely tear through basically any infantry they bring, with the exception of hammers and perhaps iron breakers in extended combat. Out on the flanks, I do have 2 unshielded units of Eternal Guard. These guys are there just to anchor things and get me a bit of a flank maneuver going. Of course, I wasn't able to bring more than 6 units of Eternal Guard with shields, so that was really the main reason I was bringing the unshielded variant here. Out on the very far flanks, I do have 2 units of Way Watchers. These guys are kind of poking away. This unit's unfortunately already lost some models, but they do have a pretty cool ability called the Hawkish Precision, which gives them plus 25% armor-piercing damage. That means they're actually going to be able to do quite a bit of hurt to the units like these Thunderers. They can definitely lay a bit of a smackdown on the enemy over a long period of time. They're definitely not no pushovers, and they're definitely pretty decent. They also have okay melee stats, so if push comes to shove, I can always throw them in as a kind of last-ditch effort. Up in the skies, I do have a Glady on an Eagle, coming with Prayer of Anathrema, as well as the Arrows of Kurnus. And of course, she can kind of poke away at enemies, and she's not a total pushover in melee either. She doesn't do magical damage there, so that's pretty good against dwarves, and gives her a lot of mobility. For my opponent, he decided to go very artillery and shooting heavy. Our front line composed entirely of Thunderers, 4 units of them actually, with Grumbrindle here at the very forefront. Grumbrindle did bring bring Unbreakable, with the Grumbrindle has no fear, as well as Foe Seeker and Runehelm Zufbar, so definitely trying to buff his infantry so that they stick around to the last, because his infantry is composed of miners, and miners of course are not particularly great by dwarf standards, though their leadership is still decent. Beyond that, my opponent does have 2 units of Slayers, shut down any large, and then 2 Orchid Guns, and finally a Grudge Thrower, as well as a Master Engineer in the back to buff all that artillery and shooting up. So definitely very shooting heavy build. As you can see, they're already laying waste to some of my units, like this poor Spellslinger here getting shot up, and as I got her too close, and that poor Eternal Guard here, and the Wildwood Rangers just getting shot the crap by the massed volley fire. Fortunately though, as you can see, sometimes artillery is a little iffy and it does kind of throw shots in awkward directions. So while these frontline troops will be very badly mauled, once I am able to get into range and into melee range, the organ guns will no longer really be effective, and that should definitely give me a good advantage. The fact that I didn't bring any units like say cavalry means that my opponent doesn't have the best of targets. In the meantime, you can see the Way Watchers are starting to tee off on the Thunders, and they're actually doing quite a bit of damage. You can see despite the 30% shields, the rest of their protection is just not there, or not really that effective. I do start committing troops into the fray, trying to get into kind of melee range with these guys. Unfortunately, these Eternal Guard will not be able to really push through. They're taking too much shooting fire, and the Slayers will mince them up very quickly. Most Wood Elf infantry, or actually basically all Wood Elf infantry, is rather inefficient when fighting against Slayers. Now, unfortunately, my opponent did a massive mistake here. I'm not entirely sure why he did this, but he casted Entrenchment on the Slayers, which does grant them physical resistance, but as they were not really targeted and they don't do missile damage, I'm not entirely sure why my opponent did this. Nonetheless, means they don't get a charge bonus, and my Eternal Guard are able to engage. In the meantime, I am able to start sweeping around the flanks. You can see the Way Watchers whittling these Thunderers down with just massed volley fire. And you can see these Way Watchers over here are taking a little bit of artillery fire, but they're starting to pick away at these Thunderers and definitely whittle them down, in spite of their shields. Over here in the melee, I do cast Earthblood on these troops, and they are slowly but surely just dicing their way through the miners. I did bring both of the healing spells on the Lore of Life caster, though I did bring Stone Skin, thinking that perhaps my opponent would bring Longbeards or Satchel Charges, and I could use it for that, but it didn't happen. I did drop a Prayer of Anathrema on these Slayers just to prevent them from getting out and about. And in the meantime, the Thunderers are starting to exchange fire with the Way Watchers, and I'm not particularly paying attention because I'm trying to kind of micro my Wildwood Rangers to my opponent's backline. The Wildwood Rangers will absolutely slice and dice their way through these miners with contemptuous ease, and because most of this fighting is happening in woods, I do believe these guys get a slight bonus, though it might be only against large. It is unfortunately only a bonus against large. That said, they do believe all Wood Elves have a slight bonus from their fighting in woods anyway. In the meantime, these Way Watchers, the Way Watchers are definitely taking some damage. I'm not being too on top of micro. They actually significantly outrange Thunderers, so if I was a bit better on micro, I could easily keep them outside of range of my opponent, but I'm simply not on top of it. I do get another Earthblood off, Overcast once again, and that means these guys are really just going to be very efficiently chewing their way through these miners. In the meantime, my Glady, who was taking some artillery fire, is starting to shift out to the flank. These Way Watchers will be forced to kind of pull back a little bit because they are obviously taking some nasty damage. And you can see the miners, in spite of everything, are still sticking around, especially thanks to that Unbreakable. Then once that drops away, they will start getting chopped through. I do believe my Wildwood Rangers here are unfortunately getting blocked by the Eternal Guard, which is saturating them. Here in the front line, you can see Grumbrindle is, because his melee defense is actually not that great. It's only 40, which is, by Dwarven standards, not the most amazing stat. It's actually getting brought down by Eternal Guard. This fight over here is between the Slayers, Eternal, and Grumbrindle. So this is a disproportionate commitment of resources from my opponent. You can see these miners finally break, and that is really allowing my Eternal Guard to kind of sweep through and keep going for the back line. These Slayers will hold for eternity, of course, and Slayers, while they certainly don't have the best of melee defense, it's not terrible by any means, and so they're actually going to be pretty tanky. And unfortunately, my shooting contingent is definitely kind of getting messed up. Although they've definitely applied a lot of pressure and kind of helped really break the backbone of some of those Thunderers and just keep them off my troops. You can see a lovely Air of Kurnus does go down there, causing a bit of damage. My Glady has been poking away from the skies for most of this game, and I haven't really been willing to commit her into the fray. I managed to sneak my Spellslinger into my opponent's backline, and she's now tying down the artillery, which is a huge benefit for me because, of course, especially the Grudge Throw is rather dangerous to the Wood Elves. Now the Glady does kind of dive down. You can see her going after the Organ Gun, just trying to shut it down, even as the Wild Rangers come in to slice and dice through the crew. And these Thunderers are tied down with the Prey of Anathema, so they're in really deep trouble, and you can see the Way Watchers just teeing off and absolutely shredding them. Way Watchers just absolutely brutal in these sort of long-distance engagements. In the meantime, the Eternal Guard is finally sweeping through the Slayers, and my opponent at this point does decide to GG out as he's being pressured from all flanks. So definitely a rather brutal game. I do believe most Wood Elf against Dwarf games kind of are like that. There's no real way to avoid it. I do believe this is a fairly competitive build. Definitely I made a mistake of not bringing Power Stone. Obviously, I didn't bring any cavalry, but my reason for not bringing cavalry was actually that I figured I could kind of pressure with the mix of the Way Watchers, and by bringing so much infantry, Wood Elf infantry is faster than Dwarf infantry, and you can kind of pincer and outflank your opponent and come around from all sides and collapse them that way. Definitely one of the other things I would consider bringing in this sort of composition would be a Branch Wraith, because the Branch Wraith, of course, can provide that melee buff, and that would have allowed me to buckle a specific point a little faster. So it's perhaps somewhere I could have stripped off a few points that were invested in some unit and done well that way. Obviously, the Eternal Guard didn't do too great. They're not really meant to kill stuff as much as they are to just tank through it, though you can see some of these guys definitely raked in a few kills, and most of this, of course, is against miners, who are a fair bit cheaper. But nonetheless, the Eternal Guard definitely can, if needed, performed reasonably well against Dwarf infantry, if only by a token of the fact they have armor piercing and good melee defense. Dwarves generally have pitiful melee attack, and that's true for all of their units except the Hammerers. The Wildwood Rangers, of course, did rather well once they got into combat. These guys, of course, have rather monstrous melee stats, and with the exception of their armor, which tends to be rather pitiful. And the Way Watchers actually did manage to do some work. They did manage to pick apart ththose Thunderers over time. Thunderers are, of course, only a 60 model unit, so 38 and 40 is actually not too bad. That definitely is some pressure applied to the backline, especially when stacked on top of the Glady. Whether or not they were cost efficient, I'm not entirely sure. They definitely distracted a lot of my opponent's fire. A lot of his artillery was focused on the Way Watchers rather than on my units. But perhaps I could have dropped one of these guys in favor of, say, a Branch Wraith. For my opponent, obviously this was a very one-trick wonder build, very much focused on the artillery and thunder, so definitely a bit surprising there. I was a bit surprised as well by the deployment, which was in the middle of the woods, perhaps hoping to shield himself from my own skirmishing ability. But nonetheless, a pretty cool build. You can see the Slayers did absolute monstrous work against the Wood Elves. The Grumbrindle did some okay work. The Engineer actually raked in a decent amount of kills, which was definitely surprising. You definitely don't see the Engineer too often. There's definitely a slight mistake my opponent made in applying the one of the Engineer's buffs to the Slayers, which also paralyzed that unit, so that was definitely a little bit of a mistake. But otherwise, definitely a cool build. I think the Thunders would have been better replaced with Quarrelers if you wanted to do a shooting build, since there's really no reason to bring armor piercing against Wood Elves. Nonetheless, great game to my opponent, Amarin21 here. I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below. If you have any comments, criticism, any questions about the game or anything like that, be sure to post down in the comments, and I will respond as soon as I can. As usual guys, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.